Welcome back to the Messy Reformation. My name's Jason Rice. I'm the lead pastor at Faith Community CRC in Beaver Dam, Wisconsin. My co-host is Willie Cronky. He's a member at Pease CRC in Pease, Minnesota. We're just a couple of guys who love the Christian Reformed Church and want to see Reformation happen in our denomination. And we realize that whenever Reformation has happened in the history of the church, things get messy. And after this past synod, things are really starting to get messy in the Christian Reformed Church. So we're taking the opportunity to have conversations with pastors throughout the Christian Reformed Church to find out what's going on in our denomination, but also to talk about what Reformation might look like. If you haven't already, take a moment, click subscribe so you don't miss any of our upcoming content. We are dropping episodes every single Sunday evening. We also want to say thank you to everyone who sponsored us on Patreon. We're slowly making our way to our modest goal of 20 sponsors at $5 a month. If you appreciate what we're doing and want to help us continue to put out content, head on over to patreon.com/The Messy Reformation. You can also support us by sharing our content. I'm a terrible self-marketer and need your help. If you know of anyone who would benefit from listening to this content, let them know about the Messy Reformation. Also, let them know about our newest announcement, the Hall of Tyrannus. We're really excited about this new opportunity to disciple reformers for the CRCNA. If you'd like more information on this, head on over to themessyreformation.com and look for the Hall of Tyrannus. With all that said, we're going to get to this week's episode, which is part one of our conversation with Kurt Monroe. So, Kurt, why don't you kick us off? Tell us a little bit about yourself, your family, and the church that you're at.
So I am going to start actually with where we're at. My family, I am husband to Jennifer. I am the father of 4 kids. I've got a senior in high school, junior in high school, an 8th grader, and then a 2nd grader. So we've got a decade in between the 4. And so it keeps things busy around the house and trying to chauffeur everybody around and all that. So we're in that phase of life. We live in Sioux Center, Iowa, and I'm the pastor of First Christian Reformed Church in Sioux Center. And yeah, so that's where we're at. Small Midwest town. I grew up in a small Midwest town, but I did not grow up in the CRC. So I grew up in Northeast Indiana, small rural community there. Prepared me, I think, well for life in Sioux Center and Northeast Indiana, though. Most of the CRC pockets are in Northwest. So my wife grew up in the CRC in Gallup, New Mexico, Rehoboth. So that's her background. She was my entryway into the Christian Reformed Church, and we had lived in Tucson, Arizona for a while. We were both teaching at a Christian high school there. And then I was teaching part-time Bible, part-time musical theater and choral music and whatnot. And I decided, I'm really enjoying teaching Bible, and ended up going to Regent College in Vancouver, British Columbia, just to I was planning on doing a 2-year master's in biblical studies and coming back to the high school classroom and teaching Bible. That turned into a 3-year Master of Divinity. And when we went to Vancouver, we were attending First Christian Reformed Church in Vancouver. And so I discerned the call to ministry in the context of the Christian Reformed Church. And so that's really where I obviously, because Jennifer grew up in the CRC, knew about CRC and really respected and admired the CRC. And that was the school we taught at, was started by CRC folks there in Tucson. But it was really that call to ministry discerned within the CRC that overlapped. And that's why I'm where I am now. So,
yeah. Amen. What church did you grow up in then?
So I grew up in a Church of Christ, which functionally there's the non-instrumental and the instrumental versions of those. And I was in the instrumental version. Functionally, they work pretty much like non-denominational churches from my experience. I had no kind of conception that we were, there's no accountability. There's no oversight from a denominational level. So we function more or less as I tell people, I don't have a lot of time to explain it, that I just grew up non-denominational evangelical. And that typically kind of is more or less accurate. that was my experience. So that's my background.
Yeah. Did you have a good experience growing up in the Church of Christ?
My particular experience was fairly decent. I mean, I think, I grew up without a lot of, obviously there's no confessional kind of catechesis. Grew up without any knowledge of, I shouldn't say without any knowledge of, but with a lack of knowledge of church history, of good depth of theology. And so I think, and that's where not growing up in the CRC, I didn't know Dort existed. I didn't know Calvin existed. And so then I did my undergrad at Wheaton in Chicago. And so that's where I was still obviously American evangelical kind of experience there, but that's where I was first introduced into a greater depth of kind of theology, church history, that kind of thing. So, and just, obviously my background there is very much an American evangelical experience, but I had a fairly decent experience in that. I think a lot of people come out of that damaged, beat up, and the home that I grew up in was good as far as parents kind of not adopting some of the worst components of American evangelicalism and doing a fairly good job of catechizing me, even without the aid of, actually the catechism and whatnot. So, So I don't have a lot of the baggage that a lot of evangelicals that you see going off into ex-evangelical kind of territory have. So,
yeah. Well, I think that speaks a good word that Willie and I have kind of seen being in youth ministry too, that again, the parents are the primary formers of a child, and you can have poor parents in a really, really good church, and those kids are not going to turn out in the same way. Or you can have good parents in a really, really poor congregation, and those kids will still turn out really well. And so it again goes back to reminding all of us pastors and youth pastors that like parents are the ones that God has given the responsibility for forming and shaping these kids, and they will have the most impact on them, no matter what we do.
Yes. And, going back to my wife and I, our experience teaching, we talk about in the CRC, the three-legged stool of the church and the home and the school, because the same could be said of Christian schools. You can have an excellent Christian school combined with an excellent church, but if what's happening at home is off the rails, it doesn't matter what the church and the school do. It's true that the home has you can say it's a three-legged stool, but that home's leg is disproportionately powerful in its capacity to mold kids.
Yeah. 100%. Yeah. I was trying to think as you were saying that maybe we need to, because I'm a big proponent of the three-legged stool. I think, is some people want to get rid of it because it's old. And I think from my experience, kids who have all three legs stay in the church, remain committed to Christ, become leaders in the church. It's a big deal. But I think you're right. It's really the church and the school are really upholding what's going on in the home. Like the home is almost foundational, I've seen. And it's the church and the school who are really supporting and upholding the home. And when that happens, then you really have good stuff happening.
Yeah, I think that's absolutely right. And I like that, reinforcing what's happening at home. That's a good way of putting it.
Yeah. So at what point did you decide to when you decided to move into teaching, were you wanting to go into teaching the Bible, or were you just wanting to become a teacher, or what was that path? How did that path look?
Oh, wow, you're asking me to dig into the depths of a history that I can't even remember myself anymore. So I mean, it's really funny. I ended up teaching stuff that I wasn't at all qualified really to teach. At Wheaton, my undergraduate degree was in English. I had a minor in music. Wheaton makes you take 14. At that point, it was 14 credit hours in Bible, I think. So I had a minor in music, and I was teaching music, and I had 14 credits hour in Bible, and that's what I ended up teaching was Bible and music. Neither of them really qualified to do that. So I landed in it. It was one of those things where the school employed, they said, we're going to go find people rather than necessarily people who are credentialed. We want to find people that will fit with what we're on about. And so it was a really, really good fit at that point. And so they said, and I did have interest in teaching music, particularly at that point, and then the Bible as well. I was both of them. never intended, looking at the way I did my undergrad and everything, that was going to be the way that played out. But God, I think, worked it that way. And it was really, really great when we were there for those. I was there 7 years. I think I taught. My wife was there for 9 years. Before we got married, she was teaching. So,
Wow.
Yeah, it was really good that way. It was a good period of our lives. And just and not to say, the home is crucially important, but the capacity for youth groups, youth pastors, you're talking about, catechesis, Sunday school, that kind of stuff, but then the Christian school too, to come alongside those parents. And because you can do some things that the parents can't do, right? Or you feel they ask you some questions, and you can, again, you want to be careful about the way you say this in the current climate where schools are usurping parents. But there are capacities to really minister to kids. And it was a great period of our lives.
Yeah, no, kind of in tandem with that, Kurt. I'm wondering your call from teaching and then into pastoral ministry, kind of, I'm very curious to know kind of what that looked like in you, and that whole process, how you processed that.
I initially processed that by pushing against any conception of a call to ordained ministry. So I kind of just thought, I don't want to do that. I don't think that's what I'm supposed to do. And so I spent the first year when I was at Regent just saying, no, want nothing to do with an MDiv, want nothing to do with ordained ministry. And then it was just kind of a process, again, all of that background, I think, coming to the realization that God was inevitably leading that way, even the undergraduate degree in English literature. And at that point, Wheaton's English department was great, teaching you to take texts very seriously on their own terms, interpreting them really set the groundwork in my mind for doing proper exegesis. And so that preparatory kind of groundwork laid at that level. And then realizing, I think part of it was just realizing partway through that Regent experience that God had used those years teaching, realizing, oh man, I was doing way more pastoral work in my interactions with students than I ever imagined I was. And just the inevitability of it, I think, was kind of, the way it works. Conversations with people within the church, realizing that that you're doing things and you're being called to do things, and you kind of at some point say, oh, stink. I'm going to have to shift into the MDiv, and I think I'm going to have to start talking to the candidacy people at the CRC, right? So just that sense of inevitability of all of those things combining to equip you and to train you up, and outside of the official kind of MDiv schooling, right?
Yeah. I love those moments. I had that moment too. I mean, I never planned on being a pastor until I was like 24, 25, and I had been doing all these other random jobs. And then you get into ministry, and then you start looking back and going, oh, all of those random things that I was doing really prepared me for ministry and have really set me up to be on this particular trajectory that I'm in right now. And at the time I thought I was just wandering around aimlessly. I mean, I was wandering around aimlessly, but thankfully, it's God who determines our steps. And so it's a cool moment to look back and see how God has been just orchestrating and lining everything up for us to be where we're at.
Yes. And, I think my case too, there was no way I would have been ready to walk out of an undergraduate degree right into an MDiv, right into a ministry. I needed to live.
Yeah.
I needed to, in the years intervening, we actually left for Regent right after my dad had been, the previous year, my dad had been diagnosed with cancer. From diagnosis to his death, it was about 6 weeks. And so, just traveling through that, spending that time in the hospital, going through that, walking with him through the valley of the shadow of death, essentially, that's one of the things I think I had to go through that before I would be myself equipped to walk with others through that as a pastor. And so I think probably a lot of people, it's fine. They just go undergrad right into seminary, right out the next door. But some of us aren't mature enough. So it's really God's protecting the flock from immature, inexperienced, ill-equipped people. So I'm really, really grateful for that kind of, wandering. What am I doing? You're right. God orchestrates it.
Amen. Yeah, I've been talking about that a lot, especially, and maybe it is especially serving in a more rural church, a more blue collar church. I feel like just the fact that I worked construction and I ran a business for a while and worked in a factory for a while gives me just a different level of credibility with a bunch of people. Like they know that I've been out in the world, I've lived, I've gotten my hands dirty, I've done that kind of stuff. And, I'm not just some young punk who just went through school and became a pastor. Like I've lived. And it's given me a whole different ability, I think, to interact and connect with people in my church. And so I'm really thankful for that. And of course, I'm kind of biased, and I think that's probably a good thing. It's probably, in general, I would say it's probably good for people to be out there and to live a little bit. And I think in a recent podcast, we even talked about trying to maybe beef up the internship period of a pastorate, just to give them some more life experience, life training before entering the ministry on your own. And that probably just comes from my own background of saying you need a lot of life experience to be able to do ministry well. And so, I've been thankful for that as well.
Yeah. And, I think you're right. I said there that I think you can do it. Go just right from undergrad, right into seminary, right out the other door. I do wonder, though, often and looking at my own experience and being so grateful for the way it worked out for me, but just wondering if a lot of problems in ministry, the Article 17s, all those kinds of things would be helped by some other life experience other than, you just say, I even think the seminary identifying high schoolers already and bringing them to the seminary, like, tell them to go get some other, study biology, study English literature, study something other than theology. Yep. Go work make sure in your summers you are working in a warehouse or a factory or something, and you're rubbing shoulders with non-academics. I don't know that you don't want to necessarily legislate those kinds of things, but boy, it's helpful.
Yeah.
Encouraging.
Amen. Yeah, I encourage it too. And that was actually, I want to say, I'm maybe known for saying lots of critical things about the seminary and whatnot, but that was one of the things that did attract me to Calvin Seminary was I had narrowed it down to Southern Baptist Theological Seminary because I really appreciate Al Mohler. So I went down, I visited that campus, and then I went to Calvin Theological Seminary and visited. And the stark contrast, and I don't know what it is, but when I was at Southern Baptist Theological Seminary, I remember walking around the campus and thinking, boy, I'm like a 28, 29-year-old guy with 4 kids, and everybody at this school is like a 20-year-old white kid, like going to seminary. Like it was just like a really young kid with no family. And then I show up at Calvin Seminary, and everybody I visited with were like, later, they had already worked a job. They were coming into ministry later. And I had people from China and Korea and Liberia. And I was like, wow, we've got like some older people who've done some life here, and we've got some more diversity going on here. That makes me want to be a part of this. And it was a good fit. Most of the people I went through school with had been in ministry even for a little while, or had been working a regular job and had a later call to ministry. And so I think that's a good thing in the CRC. I'd like to see it cultivated even more, I think.
Yeah. And even the seminary getting creative and making that, and I think, combining, I hope that moving forward, like you said, the importance of internships, but partnering with making it, possible for guys, 4 kids, working a job, difficult to, and I know the online component is going to really change this, but pairing that with, a guy can keep working, whether it's in ministry or whether it's in construction or whatever, keep working, pair that with real solid internships under the guidance of, this is where I think I wish you could combine this with the Presbyterian model, where you come under the care of a consistory And so you've got the partnership of a really good pastor under the care, the guidance of a local consistory to partner that with, long-term kind of internship work while you're doing your academic studies. I think it could be a really powerful model for preparation for ministry in the context of, economic hardships and just changes in the world more broadly. Those changes that are making it less likely for people to move to Grand Rapids to go to seminary might actually benefit ministry.
I 100% think so. And, we have tried to put some of those like, boy, I'm losing my words, but oversight from like from a council, and, you have all these different mentors. And so they're trying to get some of that tied into the local church and the local classes and all of that. But what I've seen happen is like some of the structures are there, but just functionally we're not using them, or we're not doing them well.
Right.
And so like there's this desire, and I've even heard, I've heard Jewel Maidenblick say this multiple times over the past year. He's like, yeah, well, we're coming under a lot of fire here at the seminary, but the churches need to be doing this work too. Like, this just isn't us. And I'm like, I agree with you.
Yeah.
On that. That doesn't mean you shouldn't be doing your job either, but I'm saying, yeah, right. We need to be doing this discipleship. And it kind of reminds me of a conversation I just had with a guy. He's an elder of a church that I know pretty well. And he was talking about his concern that their church, it sounds like a lot of CRC churches right now, right? They're getting older, members are starting to die off, and there's not this transfer to newer leadership. And then some of even the younger people in the church are kind of leaving and kind of wandering off into progressivism and stuff. And he's wondering like, what is going on? And it's just reminding me again, like as just a church in general at a local level, I think a number of churches have just failed at discipleship. We've failed at discipling our young people. Like, we've discipled them. This church, they had a pretty solid youth program, but then they got out of that, and then they had zero discipleship in the church after the youth program, and they just kind of were left like, well, you should be ready to go. And then the cultural winds are so strong, it kind of pulled these kids away, right? Or when some leaders did rise up, there was an older generation saying like, nah, we're not handing the reins off to you. And so like, but that's a discipleship issue too, right? Like I've seen this in the church so many times where there's a group of older people, and they've been serving faithfully for so long, right? And they're starting to get wore out. They're starting to get tired out. And then they just say like, well, why isn't anybody taking over? And I keep saying, why aren't you raising up somebody to take over for you? Instead of just saying, and then eventually what happens, they get tired, they get sick or something, and then the ball drops, and then there's nobody ready to take over for it. And then the church is left struggling.
Yeah. Yep. For sure.
Yeah. So it's just this failure of discipleship. And I'd just love to see that happen better. And I don't really know how to do it, but I mean, the reality is we just got to start doing it, right? Try to figure out the best way forward and try to help raising up these young leaders in our churches and discipling young pastors too, and actually doing some of that work of walking alongside them and help raise them up to be able to shepherd the flock. So,
yep. And that might be a segue if I can take it.
Mm-hmm.
You asked about my local community or the context of the local church. One of the things, my first call was to a church in upstate New York, and that was a unique experience. It was a church that was kind of, there were some Dutch, actually some first generation, or actually themselves were immigrants, post-war immigrants, and then first generation. And then that was mixed with about half of the congregation was something else, ex-Catholic, ex-Baptist, whatever, and they had joined that church. But so that was a unique experience out in the post-Christian or whatever, unchurched, dechurched New England kind of context. And then so I moved here, and one of the first things that I noticed was just the culture of particularly, mid-20s, even early 20s, even the young people, men and women, early 30s, how seriously they took their own faith development, but their role in the church. So Northwest Iowa, and I think it's not just unique to First Christian Reformed Church. I talked to the other pastors here in the Sioux Center area and Class of Sayakota. There's a culture here that, and I don't know, is this something where, and again, I've been here 3 years, where the previous generations have not, I mean, they are themselves still serving faithfully, but they've created a culture in which the young people are empowered and enabled to take on leadership within the church and ownership within the church. So I've got these deacons who are set and ready to go, and they're excited. They're listening to the messy Reformation. They're engaged in the life of the local church, the life of the denomination, in a way that is just kind of mind-boggling to me. And part of me is I'm still trying to myself figure out how in the world has this culture been created. So they're taking the life of the church seriously. They're taking their role as that leg in their parenting. They're taking that seriously. They're keeping their eyes on the other two legs, saying we need to make sure that the church is doing its job. We need to make sure that the school is doing its job. And I'm just flabbergasted at how incredible this is. It's something that obviously pre-existed my arrival here, but I think, man, if I could figure it out, and if we could export this across the denomination, I don't know what it is. I'm really, really grateful for it, but it's awesome.
Yeah, praise God. Yeah, that's super encouraging. And well, first, before I move on, how old is your church? How long has it been around?
The church is over 100 years old.
Okay.
So first CRC Sioux Center. So
that's so I've mentioned it multiple times on this podcast. I'm kind of into this church revitalization thing. And it's interesting when I talk to a lot of churches, not all of them that are 100 years old, but a lot of them that are 100 years old don't have the problem of this leadership thing, because it was baked into the culture of their church, which is why they survived to be 100 years old. That it somehow got in there, and they got this pattern of discipleship and younger people engaged, and this kind of regular turnover of leadership and passing the baton that was there. That's why they survived. And just this unique thing. I was like, I probably want to, probably when all my kids are out of the house, I'll think about writing a book. But I want to write a book about, one of the things I've noticed as I've talked to people is the 40-year mark of a church is always like almost the death knell of a church. Almost every time, because the people that planted the church were in their 30s, they were passionate, they had a vision. And then 40 years later, they're in their 70s, they're getting tired. They're like, but the baton has to be passed. And if they didn't do a good job of raising up the next generation, they either die or they go through a really strong period of struggle where somebody's got to kind of rebuild that church. But the churches that make it through that 40 years, they just kind of keep going because they've got the DNA that's been happening, and they have this discipleship pattern happening. And so it's exciting to hear, because you hear about all these other struggles, but it's exciting to hear churches like yours that do have, I know some of the guys in your church, you got some really solid young guys who are active, and some of the churches in our area have that as well. And so, it's a reminder for all of us that we got to be thinking about that, right? We got to be thinking about not just the next generation, but the generation after that even, and how we're doing church now.
Yeah. That's a really interesting thesis that you've got there. And I think it makes a lot of sense. And I think one of the other things that overlaps with that is the shift in, if you think about churches about 40 years old, and we're thinking about churches right now that are about that age, and some of the broader churches shifts in the way we think about church in American culture, and the way the expectations of pastors being CEOs, and really where you can get an overlap of the identity of the church really strongly tied to, say, that original church planter or whatever, and where that's baked into certain expectations about kind of thinking corporately about vision and mission and all of those things. Whereas with a church that's 100 years old, it precedes a lot of that kind of conception of the church as a business model or whatever. And it's just, nope, it's the church doing the church's business. You're doing catechesis, you're doing proclamation of the word. And even in my case, coming from a a situation in upstate New York where it was predominantly, the pastor's the head of council, the pastor is the one who's supposed to cast the vision. When that church was celebrated 50 years when I was there. But this church, it's the consistory, it's the council led, they own it. I'm just a member of the council. I'm not the head of the council. So it really, and what that creates then is a sense in which the identity of the church is never tied to a single pastor.
Amen.
It has its, it's like you said, that's baked in. The church is enabled to develop its own identity separate from pastors. Pastors can come and go, and they might serve, some of them will serve better than others by God's grace, whatever. But so, I think there's something to think about there. I like your thesis. I think you should develop that further and think about the ways those shifts have happened in American church culture too, and the way they overlap there for better or for worse, right?
Yeah, 100%. Yeah. So we'll see. I'm kind of working on it, but don't expect a book release date anytime in the next probably decade. My kids are all the same ages as yours about. My oldest is a freshman in college and my youngest is a fifth grader. So I've got a while before I'm even really thinking about writing a book, but maybe someday.
Yeah.
Yeah, but I think it's a good caution for us as we're planting churches, right? Planting churches is kind of the rage, and I think that's a good thing. We want to plant, but
yeah,
I think it's a caution for us that when we plant, we need to plant well with a good kind of culture baked in. We can't, and a lot of church plants, I think, let's be honest, a lot of church plants take on the personality of the planter. And they're very kind of personality based. And even ones that are pretty successful, I can see, 7, 8, 10 years down the road, that pastor's still the pastor and the church looks a lot like the pastor and it's kind of about him. And I think we need to be really cautious about that. But also then as we rebuild, right? So I'm in a church that we're in the process of rebuilding because at about the 40-year mark, guess what happened? Everything hit the fan and it tanked and it was really struggling for a while. And so we're working to rebuild. And there's this temptation I can feel even in myself. Like I know what I want to do, but there's a temptation to kind of dive in and take hold of the reins and make stuff happen and get the church going. And I keep reminding myself, no, step back. Don't make it about you. Make the church. And I've had to remind our church that, like, if we're going to be a healthy church, it's not me that's going to make it happen. Like I'm here to kind of help. I'm teaching, I'm guiding, I'm shepherding. But if we're going to be a healthy church, you guys have to take the reins and run with it and get us to be a healthy church. And it's hard because things happen really, really slowly. And you're like, if I would just do this, it would be done like in a week, but we're going to take 3 months to do this. But again, you got to look at that long game and think we're building slowly so that we're building something that's going to last for the next 150 years.
Yeah. Yep.
Yeah. So so you've been in the CRC now. How long have you been a member of the Christian Reformed Church now?
Since 2008 when we moved to Canada.
Okay. So 14, 15 years then.
Yep.
And so what are some of the things, you were a delegate at this past synod. So you've been a delegate at a couple synods, right? This was your second? Yeah. So you've been kind of looking at the CRC from the outside, kind of not a pastor. Then you've been a pastor for a while. Then you've been into the belly of the beast at synod and got to see some of those inner workings. And so, like, what are some of the new things that you're learning about the Christian Reformed Church, just kind of having with your involvement?
Yeah, well, maybe it is the belly of the beast, right? You see it, and your eyes get opened up to certain things as you go along, and you realize what you were looking at wasn't quite what you were looking at, and some of that even is theological. Some of that's kind of reassessing some of the things you think theologically about Cyprianism, maybe, or being Reformed or being reformational particularly. And I mean, I think for me, some of that's coming out, the nuances between, or what you mean when you say reformational, even what you mean when you say reformed and always reforming, those kinds of things. So realizing that there are at least two major strands there in the CRC, and they're not necessarily going in the same direction. But then realizing too, there is, I think maybe one of the things that's my eyes have been opened up to recently, and people have talked about this with regards to the vote counts at Synod, is kind of where I think the beating heart of the CRC is in a lot of these issues, and then kind of what gets portrayed from all of the official mouthpieces and the magazines and that kind of thing. So kind of realizing where the heart of the CRC is as opposed to where the portrayal is, and then kind of navigating that. How do you navigate that and communicate that in the local context too?
Yeah.
So
yeah, I think that probably lies beneath the frustration that many people are feeling in the Christian Reformed Church, as far as members and pastors. Those who are really frustrated with what's happening in the Christian Reformed Church are frustrated because what's coming from the denomination doesn't seem to be a representation of the reality of what's in the pew. And so it feels like there's this disconnect, right? It's almost like there's a disconnect between the body and the soul of a person happening in our denomination. And people are like, well, what in the world? I don't think the people in the pew actually believe this way, but everything coming out of the denomination seems to be kind of presenting this opposite, this other view, even though I just read, I didn't read the whole thing yet. I came across it literally like 2 minutes before we did this recording, but Paul Vanderklay had wrote an article, and he said back in like 2016, they had surveyed all of the pastors in the Christian Reformed Church, and 16%, so 16% of the pastors in the CRC were affirming.
So that was when?
2016.
16. Okay.
So about 6 years ago. So I haven't double checked to see where he got those numbers, but that's what he said. So I'll just trust that Paul's not lying. So that's a small number, but that's fairly even if he said push that number up to 20%, that's still like 1/5 of the denomination. And if you stretch that out into the pew, I bet it's probably less. I bet there are more affirming pastors than there are affirming percentage-wise than affirming members in the CRC. So we're talking a pretty small minority of people who are actually like full out affirming. And yet you don't get that feel when you read the banner or listen to our podcasts that are coming out or any of that. And that people are frustrated. And I think people are frustrated because they don't know how to move forward either. Like, right. Okay, what do we do? Like when the editor of the banner is writing things that are totally contrary to what our denomination holds, how do we, like, it sounds bad, but whatever, I'll say it. Like, people are saying, how do we kick this guy out? Like, he needs to be removed if he can't represent who we are, right?
Yes. Yeah. And that's absolutely right. I think there is a frustration that you're working against your own denomination, or at least it's, I've used the language just to explain it. People talk about the deep state or whatever. It's like the CRC has a deep state, a bureaucracy that's entrenched and that is actually opposed to the will of the vast majority of the members of the CRC. So what do you do when the people who hold the levers of power are working against the best interests, or at least the desires of the membership, and certainly what we would view as the best interests of the members and our witness before the broader world? So yeah, that's a huge question. I think that's a huge question that lies before us, is what do you do when your leadership is moving in the opposite direction?
That's all we have for this week. Stay tuned next week for part 2 of our conversation with Kurt Monroe. But until then, don't forget this is Christ Church, and he bought it with his blood. And we've been warned that wolves will come in trying to destroy the flock. So keep a close watch on your life and on your doctrine. Preach the word in season and out of season. And keep fighting the good fight in this messy Reformation.